Corn School is brought to you by BASF and Pride Seeds.
Hi, I'm Bernard Taube and welcome to Corn School. In 2018 we saw tremendous levels of gibberella ear rot or DON in corn. One of the great frustrations growers had at the time was, how do we test for it? How do we determine what level of DON we have in our sample? That's a question Ontario researchers are tackling this summer and fall. On this episode, we're joined by Dr. David Hooker and plant pathologist Albert Tenuta, who are going to share some of the work they're doing and some of the plans they have this fall to come up with a new testing procedure for DON in Ontario.
Hey, so in 2018 we had some gibberella ear rot as well as mycotoxin DON issues, right, Dave?
Yes.
And so with that, we ended up, one of the big questions was around the testing, the variability that we saw. And this year being 2019, late planted, that could be an issue again in terms of DON and that. And so we're having those questions. So, you know, last year we saw a lot of variability, right?
Yep,
And
exactly.
so, say for instance, this is a great representation of a 2 kilogram sample that we would take at from a probe sample, right, Dave?
That's right.
And so if I were to grab some of these and you were to grab yours, how many kernels would you get in there, Dave? These red infected kernels.
Well, we have a 10% mix here, don't we?
Yep.
10% mix of infected, so-called infected. I've got half a handful here, and I've got 4.
And I got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I got 10.
All right.
Do it
and
again.
here's I got 3.
And I got 8. So
Tremendous differences. And this is what we saw last fall. This is why growers were so frustrated, because they took their corn to the elevator, and then the sample was 2 parts per million, same load, same field, tested again, and it was 6 or 8.
Yeah, and many of them doing the run around the elevator,
That's right. Extreme frustration with growers. They just wanted, you know, what was the DON level in parts per million of the load, and it was very clear that more work was needed to be done in the testing to reduce this apparent variability.
So you get variability in the load, in the probe, and all that, right? And sort of this would be a good representation of, say, a probe sample or even a load sample here, right? With different the infected kernels in red here, you know, where we've got 0, right? A 1% infection of kernels, 5%, 10%, 25%, and 50%, right? And so, you know, obviously as you go higher in terms of infected kernels, you see more distribution, right?
Yeah, more uniform sample, and then we can take a subsample out of a more uniformly distributed sample, and we can expect, you know, that this would more or less be a better representation of the DON or apparent DON in this compared to a more heterogeneous sample. If we just take a subsample out of this, there's a chance that I didn't get any red kernels out of this one, even though that there were some in there.
Because they're just scattered around, right?
That's right.
And so greater probability
Yeah,
of missing
exactly.
them. Okay, so what can we do? What have we learned from last year to deal with that?
Well, what we learned, Dr. Art Shasma, our colleague, did an extensive sampling project last fall.
And this was through GFO, MAFRA funding,
That's right.
And that, right?
That's right. We knew that this was a huge source of frustration, and therefore he launched or led an extensive research project to find out what are the major sources of variability. So first we have probe samples, the probes that come out of a truck. So a 20 or a 40-ton load drives into the elevator, and then between maybe 3 to 8 probes are taken out of that load depending on the elevator and the size of the load.
And that's what we did here, right?
Yep, that's right. And so from those probes, about 2 kilograms are attained, are taken or acquired in the weighhouse.
So, you know, subsampling, that small amount leads to some variability.
Yeah, exactly.
So what can we do to change that or lower that? Get a more accurate sample.
Yeah, so once that 2 kilogram sample was in the weighhouse, usually about 50 grams of that was taken. So 50 grams is about a half a handful or so. And the alarming thing is that when you think about it, this 50 grams is what will be tested, what be ground and then extracted. This 50 grams essentially is supposed to represent a 40 or 20 ton load. And so no wonder all of this variability in the subsampling that we just demonstrated here, no wonder the tests are all over the map. So we need to do a much better job. And one of the things that we can do is coarse grind.
Well, or you take a bigger sample, right?
Yep.
So
take
instead
a
of
bigger
taking that
sample.
one little sample, how about if we ground the whole thing? What happens?
That would be very good. If we ground the whole thing, I'd say if we coarse ground that and then took a subsample out of that and then fine ground it, those particle sizes are much smaller. We can get a much more uniform sample, just like this, when we subsample. And if we grind that, we should get a very much more accurate dawn level.
So whether you're low or you're high, if you grind that whole sample, you distribute those infected kernels, the debris or whatever, more uniformly in that
That's right.
sample.
That's right, because the particle size is just that much smaller.
So if this was corn,
Yep.
and we reached in there and I got nothing
Yep.
here, now I reach in and we got 3 or 4. Those
That's
are
right.
large particles, right?
That's right.
But if we were to make them smaller
Yeah, grind the whole thing.
and make them a lot smaller, now you got smaller pieces. So again, greater distribution, you get more in that potential
That's right.
subsample.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And that's what the propose is. So Art's project identified all of these sources of variation. We have the probe variation. So here are some cloud representatives of the sources or the magnitude of the variability here. We have the probe sample. This cloud is fairly small. This really surprised us. This surprised Art on how small the variability was from probe to probe. Actually, this 2 kilogram sample actually did a fairly accurate representation of a 20 or a 40 ton load. So that's very good news.
But only if you took the whole thing, right?
Only if we took
But
the
if
whole
you
thing.
went back to doing this, it's variable again, right?
It's variable again.
Okay.
And our test results show this variability right here. So this tailgate dawn right here shows that the tailgate dawn would be our most accurate representation of the load itself. And if we just took a 50-gram subsample, like what was done in 2018, and if the actual load was 5 parts per million, we'd expect, just based on that subsample, a variation between about 3 parts per million and 12 parts per million. And that's what growers experienced last fall, that kind of variability.
Well, that's what we just saw. If these were each 50 parts per million, 10%, that would be a 5 parts per million.
That's
and we
right.
had variations from 3, 4 to 10 or so. It's the same thing, right?
Exactly. But if we ground that whole sample, made the particle size smaller, and the sample is more uniform, we take a subsample out of that and then fine ground that and extracted that. The results are just amazingly improved.
So if we took that and ground it like this into this coarse fine,
Yep.
it would be more uniform.
That's
And then-
right. So the samples would go, the variability would go from this to this. And so the variability in the probe dawn, if we grind the whole sample and subsample that, is very much closer, resembles the actual dawn levels in the field. So this is why we're so excited. And thanks to Art for all of his work into this in OMAFRA and GFO. And it just will improve. It moves the bar forward tremendously in dawn analysis going forward.
And don't forget the GFO and OMAFRA funding in that as
Yeah,
well, right?
exactly.
And so you would take that then and you still end up with the same fine grind or flour, right, to test.
That's right.
But much more uniform than what we would have experienced with just that small subsample, right?
Exactly. Yep. So there's lots of other sources of variability, and we need to work on those. For instance, how would the grain moisture coming into the elevator, how would that affect the grinding process? So there's all of these different factors that have to be really looked at before we fully implement something like this. And cooperation from the elevators and input from them in terms of the grinding speed. The timing is very important. The throughput at the elevators, all very important, whether this will be feasible or not.
So what we've learned this year, we need to put it into the field. So we're going to look at prototype pilot projects with OABA, GFO, the University of Guelph, OMAFRA, and other dealers in that, and validate this new protocol to see if we can improve accuracy and decrease that variability in the weigh scale and in the test house.